Welcome to this video on Paper 2 English Literature, Power and Conflict Poetry, and in this one we're going to be looking at the Emigree. As with all the other videos, you need a copy of the poem and you'll need a pen and a highlighter. Firstly then, let's have a look at a few pictures just to get us thinking about the poem, and we'll come back to these later. You should have read the poem already, but essentially the poem is about a speaker who looks back fondly when they had to leave their home country to be safe. And the reason why I picked these images is because they remember their country being like this, although they know now that their country is probably more like this. They compare their country in one of the kind of key ideas and metaphors in the poem to a bright filled paperweight. So I chose this image here, and it's a really interesting idea that their kind of memory of their country is encased in glass. Glass is something that allows them to see their memory clearly, but it's also maybe something that is fragile and needs looking after, needs protecting. And this is a key idea in the poem. However, a big hunk of glass like that is actually also quite heavy and quite strong. So it is both delicate and strong at the same time, giving us a sense of the sort of strength of their memory, and also very heavy. So in this sense, you could even say that maybe their, this kind of desire to remember their country as it once was is a kind of burden because it weighs them down. The other thing they talk about all the way through is this idea of sunlight. And this is a real motif in the poem that repeats in every verse. So this idea of warmth, sun giving light, brightness, happiness, all the connotations that we associate with sunlight, we can link to the idea of their memory. So these are just kind of key images that might help you remember the poem Emigree. The poem is on the left here. It's important that you pause the video here and read through it at least twice. If you can and you're on your own, read it out loud. And then when you've done that, then you can start making some notes. So it's important that we understand the literal meaning. Sometimes poems can be really confusing, so it's good to have an idea of what they're, on the surface, what they're about. And then also we have the metaphorical meaning. This poem is very much about memory, identity and belonging. And the poet seems to imagine the country as if she can have a relationship with it, like it's a person or an object that needs looking after. And then we start to see how she relates to her country and how she is connected to it. Now, in terms of context, there's nothing really specific here. The country and the speaker are deliberately anonymous, and that makes the poem's message very universal. It could be about any war-torn country or any refugee or migrant. So when we read about the speaker's relationship with her home country, we're also maybe then encouraged to reflect on our own connections to where we are from, because there's nothing specific that ties it to a particular time or place. The title is also really important, the Emigree. Emigree is a French word that means immigrant, migrant, someone who has had to move to another country or another area. But the first word, the, is this definite article, the, is English. So we have one English word and then we have one French word. And so we see a conflict from the outset because we've got two different languages, two different ideas being expressed. And these could represent the two different cultures and identities that are present in the poem. The culture of the country where she lived before and then where she moves to, and the identity and connection that she has with where she lived before, and how she then feels in the place that she has moved to, possibly. Remember, we can always say, perhaps, maybe, because we don't actually know. But those things are going to get us more marks. So let's look at the first verse. There once was a country. This phrase at the beginning is really important. It's telling us something about time, so we can use the terminology temporal marker. And it has a fairy tale childlike quality that links with the idea of the country being nameless. It's some kind of imagined or imaginary place. And we want to say a lot about a little, so let's try and say as much as we can about this very first phrase. So this fairy tale quality of the phrase has a magical and surreal kind of connotation. It seems like it's a dream. Now in this way, maybe the memory is fantasy, maybe it's not real. Or maybe it sort of romanticizes it. It makes it seem romantic in some way, or nostalgic would be another word to use here. And really what she's realizing or acknowledging is, although she presents the country in a very perfect way, she knows that it's not really that perfect, just the way that we know that fairy tales aren't really real. And in this sense, she's quite an unreliable narrator. She knows that, and she's acknowledging that her memory isn't reliable, but even if she is sort of embellishing and exaggerating her memory of this place, it still is important to her, maybe the way that we would do with childhood stories or something. So she acknowledges that she left the country as a child, but her memory of it is sunlight clear. And that's where we see this first reference to sunlight, also repeated at the end here. Then she says that it seems I never saw it in that November. Now she's talking about, that could be like when war broke out in November and she'd already left. But also think of the connotations of November. I've put some notes here. November is a time of winter, therefore of darkness and of death. So symbolically, we think about plants and things dying in the winter. This could symbolize the sort of bad times in her country, a kind of low point, a cold point. Contrasts very much with the idea of sunlight here. Which I'm told comes to the mildest city, so even a nice place to be sometimes experiences bad times. The worst news I receive of it, so we know that it's having bad times, maybe it was war-torn, cannot break my original view. So she's really admitting here that she doesn't care what people tell her about what it's like now. She's refusing to let go of the past. And she describes it as a bright, filled paperweight. I've talked about this phrase here. So firstly, it's a metaphor because her perception is, her memory is not a bright filled paperweight. And there's some ideas there in terms of what this might mean. So it's encased in heavy glass, it's strong and heavy, but it's also fragile and delicate because it's glass. The heaviness could suggest that her memories are weighing her down. The strength of this kind of paperweight could suggest how powerful these memories are. And we also have this idea of her having to look after them and care for them and treasure them. Or maybe she's trying to think about, if you think about what a paperweight does, it holds something down, it sort of tethers something. So maybe her identity is linked to this country and her memories are her way of trying to keep hold of that identity. And she says it may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. So this may suggests that she's almost unwilling to accept what it's like. But she is branded by an impression of sunlight. Now, if you are branded by something, it's like what we would do to cattle. So it leaves a permanent mark. And also it's painful, it's hot. So these memories, or even the process of remembering, maybe causes her some pain. But equally, that pain leaves sunlight. So whatever pain she experienced when she had to leave her country, she's still left with this kind of beautiful memory. Now these negative kind of connotations of November, paperweight, branded, and we've also got war, tyrants, sick, and so on and so on. Again, we see the personification of the country coming in already here. It's sick. Are kind of overawed by sunlight. So we have this contrast between what is the country like now, but she's really trying to hold on to her memory. And if we think about what sunlight does, it gives us life. It helps things to grow. So maybe she feels like she has to hold on to this memory. She has to imagine it to be like sunlight because that's what gives her hope and purpose and a sense of life. Now you'll notice as we look on through the verses that the word sunlight is repeated at the end of every verse. This is called an epistrophe. This is like repeating a word at the end of each verse. So it's just a type of repetition. You can just call it repetition. That's fine. But the fact that the writer has chosen to use it at the end of every verse is this idea that no matter what happens, no matter what hears about her, she holds on to this memory, she holds on to this positive memory, and that is the thing that remains. So there's a lot just in that first verse, but actually, there's only 3 verses in this poem. So in this sense, there's plenty to pick out in each verse. Let's have a look at the second verse, and if you need to go back to the verse to get all the notes done, then go back and pause. Here we get the white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. So we've got the words that I've picked out in blue, words to do with the military, is if you're closing in on something, tanks, frontiers, and then we've got much more positive language here, glow, white, clearer, graceful, words that we might associate with beauty and elegance. So 2 different semantic fields here that are being juxtaposed. Now we have to think of an effect. Why is that? Well, maybe this shows how things are changing. Her perception of her country is changing and her country is changing over time. And she is telling us how she remembers her country and how it is now, and showing us that these 2 things really don't match up. But as she is remembering her country, she also then remembers when she left. That child's vocabulary I carried here. So this is where she is now. Like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. And this is a real interesting metaphor here, and a simile, I suppose, because she did literally bring her child's vocabulary with her because she was a child, and she carried it like a hollow doll. Maybe because she felt empty, maybe because she was sort of yet to be filled with culture and identity and memories and all of those things. But really what's interesting here is these different references to childhood, and these come back in the next verse. But these references to childhood are really important. Firstly, she's saying she spoke like a child when she arrived here. And maybe she sort of, her growth was stunted really because of the experience. And she compares things therefore to childlike objects like the doll. So really what the effect here is that her memory of the country hasn't changed since she was a child. She's sort of looking back at it, again linking with that kind of fairy tale idea, not through an adult's eyes, through a child's eyes. And she's trying to kind of hold on to this very innocent childlike memory of what it's like. Alternatively, we could say maybe it's that she's unwilling, or she hasn't moved on from when she was a child, because perhaps she was, the trauma of having to leave home and seeing her country torn apart has sort of scarred her in some way, and therefore she's, holding on to the memory like holding on to the memory like a child holds on to a doll, as a way to like make her feel safe. So there's all sorts that we can explore here. Now she says, it may now be a lie banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. And again, we see that word sunlight appearing again at the end of the poem, end of the verse, and this idea of it may, even though things, so she's again saying her country may be like this, there may be some kind of oppression, some suggestion of, terrorism, kind of forcing views on the a certain political way on the country, but she is sort of again refusing to accept that and wants to hold on to her previous memories. In verse 3, she starts by saying, I have no passport. I think that's just a really interesting way to start the verse, and the idea of like focusing on her passport and what a passport means to us. A passport is an important document that we have to have. It's kind of government enforced, and that's a kind of big symbol of our identity as well. So the fact that she doesn't have a passport means that maybe she has a lack of identity, she doesn't belong anywhere. But also a passport is what we need to travel and to move. So maybe she feels restricted. She feels a lack of freedom because, you know, she's had to leave her country and now she's stuck somewhere else. So she says there's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plane. And all these bits that I've picked out in yellow here, we can see this kind of personification of the city really coming into its own here. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. So the city almost appears like the doll in the last verse. It takes her dancing. And then even in her new country where she experiences some negativity, then her city hides behind me. And this is really interesting because all of these bits in yellow here, this personification, presents her like a mother, like nurturing and caring for the city in the way that she's having to, or choosing to comb its hair. And then the way the city hides behind her like a game of hide and seek suggests that the city needs protection. And again, this links with this idea of the paperweight, the way she's trying to kind of hold on to the memories. You could talk about the word dancing here, this verb, and how it suggests freedom. So again, we can see the comfort and the joy that she gets through her memories of her city. And if we look at the fact that this personification carries on all the way through this verse, essentially you can talk about it as if it's an extended metaphor. Why is she using this as an extended metaphor? Well, she lost her childhood when she had to leave. She had to grow up quickly, perhaps, you know, and witness adult scenes maybe. So this kind of relationship with her country that she has now is almost like a metaphor for her lost childhood. Let's look at this little bit here in the middle as well. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. Now, we can assume that this is a reference to where she lives now. Or it could be the kind of people that are now causing problems in her old city. But it seems most likely that it's about where she's living now. So we see this repetition of they. And the pronoun they being repeated here is deliberately creating this threatening tone, as if people are ganging up on her. And this gives us the sense that in this new country, maybe she doesn't feel very welcome. And she sort of, it's almost like she's being intimidated. She says they circle her and they accuse her. Accuse is repeated as well. So the verbs are really strong. And maybe creating a sense of that she feels persecuted in her new country where she's seeking refuge as an asylum seeker or a refugee. And there's this strong sense of segregation, that she doesn't fit in here, that she is separate. And all this is ironic, really, because essentially she's left her home and come to this place to be safe, and yet the language here suggests that she really doesn't feel safe. And the fact that they accuse her of being dark is interesting because, again, it contrasts this idea of sunlight, just like the word November did in the first verse. And so this maybe is suggesting that she is an outcast. She sort of doesn't fit in, or they don't recognise her for who she is, maybe. And the fact that their city is described as their free city, again, it's not her city. She doesn't belong there. It doesn't feel like home. And then finally we get the last sentence. They mutter death, comma, and my shadow falls as evidence as sunlight. This is all very ambiguous, very vague. Remember, that's what ambiguous means. But again, we've got this idea of sunlight being an extended metaphor because it's repeated throughout the poem. So this idea of sunlight could be a metaphor for her original country or home. It could be a metaphor for how it makes her feel. And the fact that she still has a shadow, I should say it sort of reminds her of her past. Yeah. So the fact that we always have a shadow, we can't be separated from our shadow, sort of reminds her of her previous life. And this idea of a shadow is interesting as well, the kind of symbolic meaning of a shadow, because we always have a shadow. It's always there, even when we can't see a shadow. you know, it's kind of like part of us. It's never separate from our body, you know, Peter Pan style. So this is maybe like her past. You know, her shadow is always there, part of her. Even this kind of shadow could be like the dark image of her country, what it is now. But we have to remember that a shadow is created by sunlight. They're two parts of the same thing. So it's maybe like saying that, okay, yes, the country that she used to be from is a dark place now, but that always, you know, is linked back to the sunlight, the fact that it was a beautiful, happy place for her. Don't worry about trying to understand all of this poem literally. There's a lot of metaphorical language in here, and there's plenty for you to kind of pick out and be able to analyse, so that you've got a few key quotations that you can really write about in detail. So pause the video, make sure you've got all the notes before you move on, and then we'll have a look at a few of the other key ideas. So you might just want to pause here on the pictures and use these pictures as an opportunity to write everything that you can remember from memory. Put your notes away perhaps, or use them to talk through with somebody your own understanding of this poem to make sure you're really clear. So you might show this screen to somebody and ask, you know, get them to ask you, well, what is this? How does this relate to the poem? And you could talk through these pictures. Let's think about the structure then as well. I'm going to particularly zoom in on this sentence here. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. Okay, so this is two lines in the poem where of walls is part of the same sentence, but it goes on to the next line in verse 3. So here we've got some enjambement, because the sentence doesn't stop here at the end of the line. It carries on into the next line. Let's just flick back to the poem so I can show you that. I've got to find it now. Here, my city takes me dancing through the city of walls. Yeah, so that's what it looks like in the poem. And you should be able to see that in front of you. So here we've got the enjambement, and then because there's a full stop here, this then creates a caesura, a break, and then the sentence carries on. So what could we say about this? Well, the enjambement, the effect of enjambement is always kind of fluidity. Things keep moving. And this might reflect how she's had to move countries or move across borders and boundaries. Just like the sentence has to carry on over onto the next line, she had to move, you know, carry on moving from one place to the next. She wasn't able to stay still. But obviously the caesura then has the opposite effect. I found my cursor. The caesura, the full stop, makes us stop. And so the full stop creates a barrier or a sort of sense of segregation. And this could mimic how she feels restricted and unwelcome in her new country. So the caesura itself matches with the kind of literal meaning of the word walls and the connotations of walls. Walls create barriers. So perhaps the writer's trying to tell us that there's barriers between different cultures, and really the writer is struggling to reconcile or integrate these different identities and cultures from her previous country with this new identity that she's creating in her new country. So there's loads that we can say just about the structure of one line. Overall, though, the poem is written in free verse, so that means there's no rhyme, there doesn't seem to be any rhythm. So what could we say about this? Well, this could reflect the chaos and the lack of control over what's happening in her own country. I've missed a full stop there. Alternatively, it could also suggest freedom. Now remember, so our own ideas kind of juxtapose each other. What freedom does she have? Well, she decides that, you know, she's going to seek freedom where she can. So she chooses to believe and remember her country how it was, not how it is now. So she has freedom of thought. And that's a really powerful idea, actually, that she can choose how she thinks and feels. Okay, make sure you get those ideas down in terms of structure. And then let's just sum up the writer's ideas. This is a good thing to kind of put on a post-it note or in a bubble or box somewhere on your page. What is she thinking then, the writer? She's trying to celebrate her identity, or the speaker's identity. She's trying to explore the speaker's relationship with her home country. She's trying to expose the way maybe feels that she's treated in her new country, and the experience of what it means to be a refugee. So some really key ideas that we can see linked to power and linked to conflict here. And she seems quite powerless, this speaker in the poem. But the fact that she is so strongly attached to this memory makes her seem quite powerful. That's where she gets her power from this refusal to accept what has become of her country. And in this way also the writer is exploring the trauma or the impact of war on civilians or ordinary people, much like in Poppies, and we'll look at that on the next slide. So make sure you've got these ideas down. So then themes and links: identity, memory, childhood, conflicting perspectives, belonging, and again we could link it to this idea of power, powerlessness because she can't stop what's happened to her country, powerfulness in terms of how she chooses to keep hold and have control over how she thinks of her country. Checking out my history would be a good comparison for this one because of the strong links with identity, and certainly Kamikaze or Poppies because we're looking at ordinary people and how they are affected by war. So that might be something you want to note down on your page. Finally, a couple of slides to help you with revision. So you might want to put your notes away, write down those prompts or copy them down, and then use those prompts to write whatever you can remember about how Emigree relates to those prompts. And same with those quotations, they would be something that would be good to write down on a flashcard or leave them on the screen or write them down somewhere. And then try and say everything you can about them or start trying to literally commit them to memory. Get someone to test you if you wish. There's a few questions to answer there that again is a good revision tool. And then finally, a reminder of revision strategies. So remember, it's not just enough to read the poem and make the notes, you have to then revise it afterwards. So hopefully there's plenty of bits there that can help you.